more seriously, what was the context of all that? Berlin was the problem. We look back today and talk about the Cold War as if it was foreordained. The conclusion was the Russians, the Soviets would lose, and communism would lose, and capitalism and American and the free world would win, because that's the way it happened. And we all remember how Ronald Reagan talked about the likelihood of the collapse of communism, and sure enough, it took place. And so in retrospect, we project our certainty that we would come out the winners into a time when it was quite uncertain. You never knew. Maybe the Russians and the Soviet Union would win the Cold War. We didn't have such strong allies. They were in pretty good shape. Their rocket thrust, for example, was ahead of ours, and Nixon had to admit that in the debate. In the midst of all this golden glow that we look back on the day 50 years ago, we forget how close a race it was and how it could have gone either way. And back then, people were talking, not just the defeatists who would say better red than dead, and pacifists who would lay around, but serious people, big thinkers, who would talk about convergence of the two systems, where capitalism and communism would get together and in some way and compromise. When we look back on that, that was a wholly different atmosphere. And you got to remember today, 50 years from the event, you have to be 70 years old or older to remember that feeling, because a whole couple of generations has grown up assuming that we would win, and we always were going to win. So here we are, looking at an event that took place not in the context of public diplomacy, but in the context of real strategic confrontation. And the problem at the time was Berlin. And Nikita Khrushchev was eager to solve his Berlin leak, the leak of the talent of East Germany back into West Germany. And people were leaving all the time through Berlin. And this was a running sore, as it were, because all the brains and all the entrepreneurial excitement was feeding out through Berlin. And so his threat at the time was to turn over operations of entry and exit of Berlin to the East German government. And at that point, President Eisenhower would say, who remembered the airlift and how he'd fought a way through, said, before we go to Geneva for the Geneva conference that the Russians wanted very much, we would like to get some indication of progress on this threat of turning over access to Western Europe through Berlin. And Khrushchev wasn't having any, and the State Department blundered a little bit, our State Department, by saying we're planning to go ahead with the Geneva conference without preconditions. Well, Eisenhower wanted a precondition. So that was the context and the worry that was going on at the time, because sure enough, a year later, there was the Berlin Wall that went up. So here you had all these things happening that we look back on now in a kind of golden fog. But the golden fog we look back on was a real war between communism and capitalism. And that's why when these two men, these two strong men, met, and they were politicians, in the best sense of the word, they knew how to play the audience and play to the audience that they were dealing with in confrontation with the other. They were deadly serious, and they could kid around and talk about refrigerators and things like that, but there was a clear warning on the table from the Soviet Union that they were going to close off Berlin. And Nixon went there with that knowledge and wanted to get to the Soviet people, which, as you pointed out, you couldn't do at the exhibition because it was hard to get tickets. But he could speak to the Soviet peoples on television. And that was part of the deal. And there was the public diplomacy. And that was a great move. For the first time, a United States high official could spend a half hour talking to the Soviet peoples, plural, about what America was all about. And Nixon wrote that speech himself, no speechwriter, and it was translated by an American interpreter not simultaneously, every couple of paragraphs. Well done, so that on radio and on the beginning of pioneering television in the Soviet Union, millions of people could see an American making the case for America, which had never happened before. And that was the greatest significance, was not the fight in the kitchen. It was the fight for the minds and hearts of enough people who were ready to start thinking, who are these other people? And it didn't change Russian public opinion, but it began to make people think, hey, maybe the adversary or the enemy is not just an enemy, maybe just an adversary. And maybe, frankly, some of the things that they got going over there will help a steel worker have a home, and not the same home as every other steel worker. So that's what I see as the fundamental importance of that exhibition and that confrontation in the kitchen. And I did get paid back by Harrison Salisbury of the Times for getting him into the kitchen and enabling him to record the event, because he had put a slug line across the top of his notes, the Sokolniki Summit. And I said, look, I'm not pushing the Sokolniki Park, I'm pushing the kitchen. And so I said to him, could you please call it and I groped for a alliteration because he liked Sokolniki Summit. And so I said, Kitchen Conference. And he said, all right, are you one? And he called it that. Well, of course, it's been changed to the Kitchen Debate, but hell with that. It got the word kitchen in, and that's what I was selling.